preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Thank you very much for coming out on this bad night. It would take more than a lecture normally to get me out. I said that tonight I would talk about books, and I'd better define first the particular group of books that I propose to talk about. I'd spoken of a sort of a tension between what is called normative Judaism, represented by the rabbinic writings and by the mainstream of Jewish tradition, and those that were outside of this tradition. The best overall title for these books that I propose to talk about is the Hebrew Sfarim HaChitzonim, the outside books, just simply outside. That is, non-canonical, not part of the recognized scripture, and not part of the Talmudic literature. Some of these were written in Greek, as, for example, notably, Philo, Josephus, and some of the fragmentary historians from Alexandria, perhaps a book like Fourth Maccabees or Aristeas. Most of them were written in Hebrew or in Aramaic, Hebrew the learned language and Aramaic the vernacular, in Palestine, and were translated into Greek for Jews, not really for non-Jews. They have survived only in the church because the Jewish tradition was not only ignorant of them, but willfully thrust them aside. We have a saying of Rabbi Akiva, among those who have no part in the world to come is he who reads the outside books. There was a great outpouring of literature, and some of the books that belong to this category are still turning up. For example, in the 19th century, we have such things as the Assumption of Moses, the Testament of Job, the Book of Adam, the Odes of Solomon, which were previously not known, and presumably others might be coming up. As far as the Jewish scholarship is concerned, these came to attention only in the 19th century. Earlier Jewish scholars were apparently quite ignorant of this entire literature. If they thought of it at all, they thought of it as an appanage of the New Testament. I also wish to speak, if time permits, of some books in the mainstream of classical literature which in my judgment, were influenced by these other books, canonical or otherwise, and which in that way constituted the fusion which I conceive as the general subject of these lectures and have directly influenced European civilization. The main one, of course, the main channel is the New Testament, but I shall try to show you that perhaps a book like Virgil's Aeneid was also a very wide channel of certain elements of Hebrew thought to Europe. Now, to systematize the group, they should be divided, or they have been divided, into three separate categories. The visions are purely mechanical. They run one into the other, and it's very hard to see why one has been put in one section and another in another section. The first category, of course, is the Apocrypha itself. The Apocrypha are books that are semi-canonical, canonical in some churches, which is a familiar item on the periphery of Scripture, or rather sometimes in Scripture itself. The word Apocrypha is a plural of apokryphon, Greek word which means hidden away, something that's hidden away. And as an adjective in English, the word usually means something like mysterious, or something which lacks genuineness, something that's spurious. And it's hard to see why that term came to be used at all. I simply cannot understand it. Possibly it is a translation of the Hebrew Sefer Ganuz, as Farim Ganuzim, books hidden away, that is, books which were not recognized as canonical. It is hard to see why some of them were not, just as it's hard to see why some in the canon were included. I think that a thing like the Prayer of Manasseh is certainly more inspiring, more deeply religious, perhaps than the Song of Songs. Ecclesiasticus or Ben Sira, I believe, is a better book than Ecclesiastes. Even Judith might be superior to the Book of Esther, but this is the way it is. How to define it? Well, a simple definition is that if you take the Greek Bible, the four great manuscripts of the Greek Bible we have, the Vaticanus and the Alexandrinus and the Sinaiticus, all of which belong to the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, and you subtract from that what is in the Hebrew Bible, the overplus is Apocrypha. It is to say, the Greek Bible has more in it, the Greek Old Testament, than the Hebrew Old Testament has. When the Vulgate was made by St. Jerome, he followed the Greek Bible and included in the Vulgate everything that was in the Greek Bible. At the Reformation, the church went back, the Protestant church went back to the Hebrew Bible, and these other books were left as a sort of an appendix. They continued to be printed in the Hebrew Bible, in the English, German translations of the Bible, and were distributed at the places where they belonged, chronologically or historically. For example, the Epistle of Jeremy and the Book of Baruch were printed along with Jeremiah, because Baruch was Jeremiah's secretary. The additions to Esther, the additions to Daniel's were printed, of course, in their appropriate place. First and second Esdras were printed along with Ezra and Nehemiah, which are in the canon. Then presently they were all taken out and printed together at the end as a sort of an appendix. And then in the 19th century, the very, very influential British and Foreign Bible Society decided that they were not to be printed in Bibles at all. The British and Foreign Bible Society printed and circulated more Bibles than anyone else. And so people who read Bible, who knew the Bible very well indeed, Puritans, lost knowledge of it because they read it, of course, it was edifying reading, but not considered so much a part of the Bible. For example, those of you who know something about pictures, let's say, or literary allusions, will find many, many pictures of, say, Judith, Holofernes, with Judith with the head of Holofernes. I think there's one of Botticelli, and there's one of Mantegna. Or Susanna and the Elders is a very common theme. I think perhaps the best known one is Rembrandt. And of course, many, many literary allusions. We don't have those anymore. Well, we don't have many biblical things anymore anyhow, but we don't have them because they've been shut out, so to speak. They're outside. In the Catholic Church, the books which we call the Apocrypha are canonical, sometimes deuterocanonical, but canonical nevertheless. And the Church calls pseudepigraphical another apocryphal, the group which we call pseudepigraphical, which I will explain presently. Now, first I'll give you simply an inventory, read off the titles of these books and say a word or two about them, and talk a little bit about two or three. I'm interested in them not as books, but merely as illustrating the theme which I've been trying to follow through all of these lectures, which is of mutual influence. I want to show those which manifestly show Greek influence, and which succeeded in transmitting a Hebrew influence. In other words, affecting a kind of an amalgam, a kind of a confusion. Well, in their order, the books are as follows. The first Esdras and the second Esdras, alternatively called third and fourth Esdras, this is very confusing, which is the Greek term for Ezra. They are, first Esdras particularly, is of no very great consequence, What it does is to combine the information at the end of Chronicles and in the canonical books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and to tell that story of the resettlement of Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. That's first Esdras. Second Esdras, which is quite of a different character, it is an apocalypse, and I shall speak of apocalypses later on. Generally speaking, both of these are inferior books. Next in order is the Book of Tobit, which is one of the few that everyone knows, or that most people know. This is a story of a very good man who made it a practice of burying dead people whose burial was prohibited, people that had been executed by the king. And he buried one, and then because he was unclean because of contact with the dead, he spent the night outside. And some sparrows, some very ill-bred sparrows, spat at his eyes and caused him to go blind. And, well, he recovers eventually with the help of the angel Raphael, who appears in disguise. There's a lady there, a charming lady, who is having terrible trouble with her marriages. She'd been married 7 different times, and each time her husband had died on the wedding night because of a demon. And she was being considered as a kind of a hoodoo. Not many people wanted to marry her after this. And there was a large deposit of money which had been left and needed to be collected. In other words, a very good story, full of incident. But you see, this is not a particularly Jewish story. It's been made Jewish, it's been made pious. As we have the model of it in the Book of Apocrypha, we've got models in Persia, we've got models in Egypt. It was known all over the world, and it was a popular book in Hebrew literature too, and has left quite an influence, because we have, as I say, only the Greek of these things. The next one is the Book of Judith, which is a romance, and this is one of the 2 or 3 that I wish to speak about at length, so I'll say nothing now. There's the Rest of Esther, called the Rest of Esther. This is practically the whole of our Book of Esther plus. In other words, our Book of Esther is a precipitate of this Greek Esther rather than the other way around, rather than the Rest of Esther being an extension. You've got some additional prayers and additional material of various kinds. The Wisdom of Solomon, which is a very good book. There's one little technical point that's of interest. It was originally, obviously, written in Hebrew, the first part, the Semitic part, and then somebody brought it down to Alexandria and translated it, and then the translator continued it with a Greek original. And you can tell this from a different point of view. There are 2 different hands here, but they both write Greek alike, so this is the only solution for it. It's a highly spiritual book. It talks against paganism, particularly against theory. And from the theological point of view, which I'm not going into very much, it presents a novelty in that you're speaking of the salvation of the individual. When you talk about salvation in earlier Jewish books, you talked about the salvation of the entire people. Israel is going to be restored, but not individuals. And in the Wisdom of Solomon, that is done. This is a book which was very influential in the church. Next, one of the most charming books in the collection is Ecclesiasticus, which belongs to what is known technically as wisdom literature. This one is more familiar as Ben Sira, which was the name of its author, Ben Sira. And there I want to talk about that at a little bit greater length, so I'll leave it for the moment. There's Baruch and the Epistle of Jeremy, about which little needs to be said. This is an expansion, let's say, of the book of Jeremiah, the writings of Jeremiah. There are additions to the book of Daniel, which itself was written only in the first part of the 2nd century BC. And this includes 3 things. The piece that's called the Song of the 3 Holy Children, which is a ridiculous name because they aren't children at all. They're grown men, but this is children in the sense that you speak of the children of Israel. Devout piece. There's the story of Susanna, which is a real love story, and presumably widespread the world over. This is a story of the beautiful Susanna, There were two lecherous old goats who had designs on her, and they sneaked up to watch her while she was bathing in the backyard, and then jumped on her and said that either do our will or else we will cry out and say we found you in the arms of a young man. But she cried out anyhow, and she was condemned to death and on the point of being executed as an adulteress, when wise Daniel, this is not really the same Daniel, it can't have been, said, now wait a minute, we're hurrying too fast. And so he took the two old men and examined them separately and said, what kind of tree was it you said you were standing behind? And one said he was standing behind an oak tree. The other one examined separately said he was standing behind a fig tree, I think it was, but some other, it wasn't an oak. So the young man, by his shrewd cross-examination, proved that the girl was innocent, and she lived happily ever after, and the old goats were executed as they richly deserved. The third addition to Daniel is the story of Bel and the dragon, and this is a real whodunit, because there was the idol Bel who was fed every night by his ministers large quantities of delicious food, and they insisted that he was a god because, you see, he ate the food up. But in point of fact, some people came in and swiped the food after the temple was closed, and this was discovered cleverly by sprinkling flour on the floor and then detecting their footprints, you see. So this is a real modern whodunit, and it's very exciting. Then we have a piece that nobody can date, nobody can understand. It's a very beautiful piece, as beautiful as anything in the prophets. It's called the Prayer of Manasseh, who was a king in Judah. Just a prayer, and it's very fine. And finally, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and I'm going to talk about 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, those that I wish to talk about, not because they're superior, but because they're grist for my particular mill, is Maccabees, Judith, and Ecclesiasticus. And I'll say something first about the first book of the Maccabees. This presents history from 167 to 134. In other words, the first part, the main part of the Maccabean Revolution. It is a good book, and it's a fine piece of history, possibly the best written piece of history in the entire canon of Old Testament and Apocrypha. Very, very different dish, however, from the Book of Chronicles. It follows dates carefully. It includes many documents, like a first-class historian should do, that is, decrees, letters, and whatnot, which apparently are quite reliable. But it also is the best example I know of a kind of historiography which the classicists keep talking about, which is Hellenistic historiography. And this explains some of the content and some of the points of view. You see, in the 4th and following centuries, historians of Greece did not follow their predecessors by operating chronologically through annals, summers and winters, or whatever system, but they conceived history as a kind of a drama. They tried to make it sensational. They tried to make it into a plot with a beginning, middle, and end, a high point in the middle. And they tried to give it one outstanding character who may in fact not have been the principal character in the historical events, but who lent himself to treatment as the principal character, as the protagonist of a drama. Now, this is easy to do with people like Alexander, where Alexander is an interesting man and also the main figure in his wars. It is questionable whether Judah was quite as important as he's made out in this particular account. Now, this to me, this is very, very interesting as bringing in, as illustrating the new type of history. For example, the history of Polybius, which is written in the old style, and Polybius is more or less a contemporary, a later contemporary of the author of 1st Maccabees, who must have been contemporary with the events, who idolized Judah Maccabee himself. Polybius is talking about a historian named Phylacus, who is writing about a siege of Corinth. And he says, I want to find out about Corinth. I want to find out about the politics, the international arguments. I want to find out about the military campaign, analyze it and understand it. And what does this man tell me? Well, he gives me a picture of a lot of wretched women with their hair down, beating their bosoms and dragging their scrofulous children along by the hand. And I'm not interested in this. This man's trying to make me cry. He's just plucking at my heartstrings to give me something that's sensational. Well, you can see the effect of this on the historiography, on the history of First Maccabees. Because to come back to this type of narrative, now in Greek tradition you had a discussion of what's the truth of a diegesis, what's the truth of a narrative. I mentioned this in speaking of the second book of Maccabees, which covers only 15 years of the first book. It's not a continuation, it's just 15 years, but much more inspirational, much more edifying. It tells you the story of Hannah, for example, and the 7 children, and things of that kind. Well, this one was written in Greek, incidentally, as I've mentioned before. What we have got is an epitome and the epitome sign. Jason of Cyrene, the first Maccabees, is anonymous, like most of this literature is. Well, aside from the material in hand, I think you might be interested in this anyhow because it'll still work. Imaginative prose, literary prose accounts can be divided into 3 categories. One of them is called pseudehistoria, false history, alethehistoria, true history. And the third kind is plasma, or hos gnomena, things as they might have happened. False history is something where you're no question whatever. You know that it isn't so. It's completely fantastic. A book like Lucian's True History, for example, starts out in its first section with a sentence saying, there is only one sentence of truth in this book, and that is the following: there is no truth in this book. Well, you know where you are, you see, you know what to believe. True history is a chronicle, a literal chronicle, almost like a telephone book. You don't like the telephone book, the author of the telephone book, to use any imagination whatever. It wouldn't be proper. You want to be sure that the number that's recorded is the number that you can reach, and this is true history. Well, that's not a work of art, you see. The real work of art is the plasma, which is not imaginary but imaginative history. And it has 3 rules. The kernel of it has to be true. So when he talks about this Maccabean uprising, that part has to be true. The expansions have to have absolute verisimilitude. If these things didn't happen, there are things that might have happened, indeed that should have happened. They're true, psychologically true. Which is the same rules for drama, that poetry is sometimes truer than history, as Aristotle says, because the historical account, the speech the general may have made was freakish, not a proper one. You can't learn from it, but you want to know what is proper. And thirdly, it must be edifying. You have to have psychagogia, which is attraction, psychological attraction. You have to have ophelia, which is usefulness. These things have got to show some kind of utility. If you consider that and place it against the doctrines, and I repeat that this was a, quote, a literary, unquote, age, the most literary age in the world. Everybody knew the rules. You knew whom you were writing for. That explains Second Maccabees. I go on to the Book of Judith, which, from a literary point of view, is more interesting. Name of the lady simply means Jewess. Possibly it's a balance to Judah Maccabee. It was written in the time, clearly written in the time of Judas Maccabee and the uprising. And the story it tells is as following. Once upon a time, a tremendous king of the East named Nebuchadnezzar, with an enormous host, was advancing towards the west, towards a city called Bethulia. And he sent his general to conquer Bethulia when people refused to submit. His general's name was Holofernes. Holofernes sent emissaries around to ask for earth and water, which is a token of submission, and the people of Bethulia refused, and Holofernes proceeded to lay siege, and he cut the water supply off, and the people, the elders in Bethulia, were on the point of surrendering, and Judith, who was a widow, a very pious, very devout widow who went dressed in sackcloth and fasted and prayed all the time, scolded the elders and said that they shouldn't do what they were doing, that if they'd give her 5 days, she wanted 5 days, they would all have plenty of water. She would do it. She was so inspiring in her speech that they trusted her, whereupon she put on beautiful, beautiful clothes, used lots of cosmetics, used lots of perfume, took a servant and took a lunchbox with a kosher salami in it, or kosher something, and went out to Holofernes' tent, to which she was admitted, and Holofernes was very pleased to see her. This part reads exactly like a Greek romance, and his intentions were completely transparent, as well, she had meant for them to be, and after she was there for 3 or 4 days, putting him off, apparently on grounds of ritual impurity, they had a big blowout one evening, and he was very happy, and he drank too much, and he went to sleep. Whereupon she cut his head off, which was not polite in the circumstances, but she did it. And now, her lunchbox being emptied of salami, she put the head in the box and came back and displayed it to the people at Bethulia and said, if you attack tomorrow, they will be so disconcerted that you will certainly win and you'll have plenty of water. And sure enough, they did. And there was a great victory, and she put back on her sackcloth and lived in great virtue until the age of 105. And that is that story. Now, this is clearly an edifying story to encourage people in time of war, to encourage people to observe all their rules, no matter what the pressures are from the outside. You see, this lady did it, and she was a very nice lady. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to make I'm not really trying, because the story is funnier than I make it, but I treat it with a certain degree of levity, because these two elements, the piety, the 105-year-old widow wearing sackcloth, and this gay young lady steeped in Chanel No. 5, just sort of don't jibe very easily, and the kosher salami and the head of Holofernes occupying the same lunch basket is a little strange. Well, now, some scholars, some fundamentalist scholars, are still looking for Bethulia. The Catholics, for example, are. It's so obvious that this is a pious romance. Thing is, you get a book and you print it in 2 columns and bind it up with black covers and red edges and a little string at the top. And you read it in a certain way. But you see, it shouldn't be read that way. It is a romance. And all credit to people who included it. The story itself is obviously inspired by Herodotus, where a big, bad, tyrannical king from the east is going to make an overwhelming expedition against God's elect, who happen to be the Greeks, and is, well, almost providentially turned back. The gay Kai-Hudor that Holofernes asked, the earth and the water, is fascinating. It has come through the original Greek model of Herodotus, through the Hebrew version back into the Greek and into the English translation. There's nothing could make it clearer than that the model was Herodotus and that expression, earth and water. But more than anything else, and I'm saying this not by way of gloating as a pagan, but this is interesting. In the island in Rhodes, the Lindian Chronicle, there is a chronicle. The date of the particular stone in question is 99 BC, but it's certainly a much older story. The story it tells is this, that when Darius was going to attack the Greeks, he came to Lindus and demanded their surrender and cut them off from water. And the goddess Athene descended on the roof of the temple and said, just wait 5 days. I mean, the 5-day period, the water is perfectly obvious. Of course, Judith couldn't use Athena. You've got this pious widow taking Athena's part. That's the reason she seems so awkward in the story. And sure enough, at the end of 5 days, it rained cats and dogs, and the Greeks were delivered by this providential intervention. What is interesting is that this period of great devoutness, of great piety, of national feeling, and all the rest of it, there was not the slightest feeling, and this, as I say, was the attitude until 70 of the Common Era, not the slightest feeling against using this material. The man didn't do it surreptitiously. This isn't a case of plagiarism. It was understood that this is common good. This belongs to everybody. This is a pious story, and you can use it. And you, just as you use the other forms of literature that I'm talking about. So here is, I think, the story of Judith, which people usually, well, it may not have great specific gravity, but I think this is a fine and interesting piece and illustrates better than anything I know the points that I've been trying to make. I talk finally of Ecclesiasticus, which should be called Ben Sira, which is its proper name. And here we have a date, because we have got a proem which was written by the translator. And the translator says that I brought this book, which had been written by my grandfather. I brought it down to Alexandria, and I translated it into Greek in the such and such year of such and such king, which is equivalent to 132. Therefore, the grandfather must have been, most people reckon, about 180. It is a long book, and it belongs to the category which we call wisdom literature, like Proverbs. And I think it's probably a better book than Proverbs, so of course it is not canonical. From a scholarly point of view, what is of interest is that when the Geniza was found in Cairo, there were some scraps of Ben Sira in Hebrew. And everybody was much excited because they thought, aha, here's one of the books for which we have the Hebrew original. And then they began to suspect that this Hebrew was not the original, but a retranslation from the Greek. And now it's been justified because there are scraps of it at Qumran, which seem to be like the scraps from the Cairo Geniza. But that's just a little incidental point. The thing that to me is fascinating about this book, which was written early in the 2nd century before the Common Era, written before the Maccabean uprising, is that of all of the things that we have, this has the most Attic atmosphere. It is a wonderfully civilized book. The man is interested in all kinds of things. He likes music. He likes elegant oratory, all of the things that the Greeks would like. He is particularly concerned with various handicrafts, small arts, and praises people who practice these things. He is much interested in good secular government, people who take part in administration and do their job well. He is very pious. He has all kinds of good things to say, and yet he questions, indirectly at least, the propriety of bloody sacrifices at the temple. He's been thinking about it. I think most typical is his attitude to doctors. He has a great deal to say in praise of doctors. In one place he says, Lord help you if you fall into the hands of a doctor, but he seems to have known a great deal about doctors. But the thing that interests me most is, he says, if you fall sick, remember to pray and to offer charity and to do things like that. But don't forget to go to the doctor. Don't get so bound up in your prayers and charity as a means for curing that you've... this seems to me to be so thoroughly Attic and really charming. The part of it that most of us know, that is, if we're in the habit of frequenting Episcopalian funerals, is the section on the praise of famous men. Let us now praise famous men and the people who were before us, who have done good things. And he mentions all of these various categories of people that make civilized living possible. And he mentions among them the inventors. And I love him dearly because he includes prominently among the inventors those who invent new songs. Not new hymns and new psalms necessarily, but new songs. And this is a good thing, and they're people to be praised and to be remembered. In a sense, this is an illustration. You see, most of the pious books that we have are directly bent on piety. This is one of the reasons that I like some of the 12th century literature in Spain, the Jewish literature, because you get pure belles lettres. Well, this isn't belles lettres, this is serious wisdom literature, but from a rational, secular point of view. Well, so much for the Apocrypha proper. The next category has even less rationality. It's called Pseudepigrapha. Some scholar named it that in the 18th century. It's very, very fluid as far as its boundaries are concerned. It includes all kinds of things. A pseudepigraphon, of course, means something that is falsely ascribed. That is to say, the wisdom of Solomon in the Apocrypha is surely a pseudepigraphon, because surely Solomon could not have written it. This is impossible. For that matter, to ascribe Proverbs to Solomon is probably also a pseudepigraphon, but here I won't say. But that's what pseudepigraphon means. It contains a great variety of books, and I want to talk about two or three of them, which are, again, grist for my mill, particularly the Book of Aristeas, the third book of the Maccabees, the fourth book of the Maccabees, and perhaps two or three other things, because I want to get on to the Greek literature proper. Now, Aristeas is, to me, a fascinating book, and I may explain why I choose to talk about him. It's because I know him rather better than the others, because him and the third Maccabees and the fourth Maccabees, I myself once, in the folly of youth, made learned editions of, with long introductions and a translation and a little thin trickle of text held up by two stout columns of commentary as they go along. But this is a fascinating book. Its date, I believe, is the middle of the 2nd century. Its locale, of course, is Alexandria. And it starts this way. Demetrius of Phaleron and Ptolemy Philadelphus are talking. Now, of course, this is impossible because Ptolemy was mad at Demetrius. Demetrius was a friend of Ptolemy's father, Ptolemy Lagos. And the two couldn't have been talking this way, but this shows you how you make a plasma. What you're trying to do is to get the grand monarch of all of the Hellenistic kings, the great patron of letters, which was Ptolemy Philadelphus, and the best-known philosopher, who was Demetrius of Phaleron. And Ptolemy says to Demetrius, "Have you now collected all the books from my great library which I'm building?" And Demetrius says, "Yes, sire, I have. Not quite all of them, but because there's some Hebrew scriptures which are very important. Well, why didn't you get them? Didn't I give you enough money to collect everything?" And Demetrius says, "Yes, you did, but these are books that are not in Greek. They require translation." "Well, I take all the money you need and get translators." So Ptolemy himself writes a letter to the high priest in Jerusalem, addressing him fully as an equal. This is important, as royalty addressing each other as cousin or something like that. And his request is for a panel of translators. He understands that there are 12 tribes, and if he has 6 translators from each tribe, he'll have a panel of 72 translators, and they will do the job. The messengers come, they're received by the high priest. You have a long description of Jerusalem, from which it is perfectly certain that the man who wrote it never could have seen Jerusalem, and a description of the dignity and the ritual of the temple, and a long description, pages and pages long, of the valuable golden gifts for the temple which they had brought. See, this is still this style of literature. It has to have an ekphrasis in it. That's what they taught in courses on creative writing, how to describe works of art. So it's all in there. Then, of course, there weren't any 12 tribes then, which the author should have known. See, the author pretends to be an observer, and he's writing this as a letter to his brother. He says, "Brother, I know you're interested in curious things like this, and I want to tell you how the Septuagint came to be made." The messengers come back. They're welcomed lavishly and invited to a series of dinners. And there are 11 dinners, or wait a minute, seven dinners, at which there are 10 questions asked at each dinner, except I was trying to get 72 in. The last two have 11 instead of 10. And then there's a question, now how about these people from Israel? Will they be able to be entertained? And the major domo says no problem at all. Everybody peoples have their own particular ways and their own particular diet. It's no trouble. We've entertained all kinds of people. We can entertain them. They're asked, and during the dinner, these questions, these philosophic questions are posed. Well, the odd thing is that we have all of these questions in an Indian book, Milinda Panda, which is called in Greek The Wisdom of Menander, not the playwright. And they're all philosophic questions which these translators answer exactly as they are in the Greek books, except each one has a little pious note added to it, with God's help or something like that, you see. It all becomes a little pious, Gesundheit, and little pious touches like this all the way through. And there's a gallery watching them while they're eating and answering these questions, well-known philosophers at the time, Demas and so on, and they applaud loudly. These are very, very wise men. And then they're put off on the island where the lighthouse was, Pharos, and they do the translation. Incidentally, the story which you know, that they were put into separate cells and then compared their translation, found it was identical. This is a later embroidery. The story kept getting more and more and more embroidered. Here, it's not as unreasonable. The task was divided, and in point of fact, if you look at the Septuagint, particularly in the first part in the Pentateuch, most of the books do divide in two. You can see that this job of translating was handled by two people. One went from the beginning to the middle, the other went from the middle to the end. They deliver their work. They are thanked enormously for it. A festival is established to commemorate this. The king tries his best to persuade them to stay in Alexandria, but no, they will go home. What's this about? I mean, what is it for? Well, in the first place, possibly to establish, just as Esther establishes Purim, maybe this established a festival in honor of the Septuagint, which we know nothing about anymore. That may be it. It may be merely to give credit to the Septuagint, which apparently was revised in the middle of the Pentateuch part, in the middle of the 2nd century. It is to show any Gentile Greek who may come across it. This, to me, is the obvious reason, that after all, in a great age, at a later period, you see, when the Jews were under certain disabilities, you could read that such a great king as Ptolemy Philadelphus thought well of them and treated them so handsomely and respected them and gave them these presents and so forth, to show that you see, I've told you once about Heliodorus and all these other novels which are trying to make credit, to establish the native, the people that were peripheral, to corroborate their self-esteem and to show that they're worthy of being accepted into Hellenism on their own terms, because they themselves have all traditions and they're cultured people. They're not savages, they're not barbarians. But also, and I think this is very important, to show the Jewish reader as to how many Gentiles got it. I've often wondered, and I'll say something about that later, whether they did actually read this book, whether you could go down to the bookstore and buy it, which of course you couldn't do, whether it ever got into general circulation. But it is also addressed to the Jews to show, well, it's perfectly possible to get along with the Greeks, to talk philosophy with them, to dine with them, if you please, and still to maintain your own integrity. The old system that I spoke of for Heliodorus, borrow as much as you can, keep a pace with the highest, best progress of civilization, of philosophy, which is in keeping, which does not violate your own particular values, which you have to cherish. I say that because I've got to put that together with the third Maccabees. Now, there's no reason under the sun for the third Maccabees to be called the third Maccabees. It has nothing to do with a Maccabee, except that it was fortunate. If it didn't have that name, it wouldn't have been saved. So that's where it is. It's not in the Apocrypha, it's in the Pseudepigrapha. And the story there is as follows. That when Ptolemy Physcon fought the Battle of Raphia in Palestine and tried to go into the temple and was turned back as being a pagan and therefore not admitted to see all the wonderful sights. He got real mad, and when he came back, he resolved to make all of the Jews in Egypt convert to the religion of Dionysus, gave orders that they all be branded with an ivy leaf, which was a sort of a trademark of Dionysus, and they didn't like it. So he had them all arrested, and he brought them in, and among great horrors, and you can see this, it's very moving. He got them all into the hippodrome where he was going to execute them. And then there are a series of the oddest miracles you ever saw. One morning he oversleeps. One morning the pen and paper gives out so they can't register their names. It's put off by one miracle after another. And finally, I'm leaving out the heart of the thing, but this is the important part. Finally, he's got these 500 elephants, and he gets them all drunk, and they're supposed to trample down all of the Jews who are gathered together in the hippodrome. And you know what? These elephants, instead of trampling the Jews, turn around and trample the Jews' enemies. And so the king repents and gives the Jews license to kill all of their bad friends, which they do. It's a rather savage book. It's not at all edifying. It is very much like Esther in that respect, somewhat perhaps to softer sensibilities, objectionable. But the point is this: how about the date? The date here I am quite certain of, because after Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31, and Cleopatra killed herself, you know, with an asp and so on. You've all read Shakespeare, if not the ancients. Egypt became Roman. It had been a Roman sphere of influence before, but it had not been a province. One of the first things that the Romans did was to regularize the administration of the province. The main thing to do is to regularize citizenship. Now, for the past couple of centuries, the Jews have been extremely prominent in Alexandria. They were very rich, and they had a great deal to do with managing the people. They went to the gymnasium. I told you that the alumni of the gymnasium were the people who ran affairs. And now the Romans suddenly deprived them of their status. And only Romans and only people who were Greeks, but everybody else was called the Persian Perses, Epigones, would not had to pay a tax called laographia, which is a poll tax. If you paid a poll tax, you're not a citizen. If you're not a citizen, there are certain businesses and other things that you can't engage in, and so the community was ruined. And this explains the great indignation. I mean, this is a response. In another sense, it is also a response to Aristeas. Here's Aristeas, which had become something of a classic, which is preaching a kind of latitudinarianism, live and let live, move into the mainstream of culture. And here's a book which is saying that any compromise, any least compromise is dangerous, that an inch is as bad as a yard, and the minute you give an inch, you're sunk, and you teach absolute partition, absolute separation, no kind of integration whatever. I think you take those two things together. I told you that I made an edition of that one time. Now let me just tell you how people can't read books. Being a very conscientious young man, I looked at all of my predecessors, and the previous man who had made a German edition of this book boggled over those elephants, because we know at the Battle of Raphia, Ptolemy had 70 elephants. That's recorded in history. And now he got 500 elephants. So this German professor says, I was very good. I went to my colleague in the zoology department, and I put the question to him, is it possible in one generation, or a generation and a half, an elephantine generation, for 70 elephants to multiply to 500? And the professor of zoology said, ausgeschlossen. I mean, this is impossible. You can't have such a thing. Ergo, says my editor, this book is a false book. This is what I mean by talking about plasmata. If the author knew that you were going to get after his statistics with an IBM machine, he would have been startled. You see, 500 elephants means a lot of elephants. In fact, a hell of a lot of elephants. And if you're standing there and they're rushing on you, 2 elephants are enough. I mean, you can call them 500 elephants. This is what he's trying to say, which is the danger of scholars who are unable to read literature. And I think this same kind of thing has affected so much of the writing on these books. Well, the time is going on. I've got, I'll mention one other, and that's the 4th Maccabees. Say a word or two, because I want to get into the Alexandrian literature, which is most abundant of all. 4th Maccabees at least has something to do with the Maccabees. This is the main source. It's in the 2nd Maccabees, but not so full, about the martyrdom of Eleazar and of Hannah and her 7 sons. This is one of the best written books in the group. I would say the best written. It's a work of art. It moves in a philosophic background. Its title should be On the Sufficiency of Reason or something like that. And Eleazar is a Stoic philosopher, actually, and the king is a very decent fellow, Antiochus, who is trying to make him retract in public. And the audience here, I don't know whether this is written in Alexandria. I've suggested that it might have been written in Antioch, to use as a kind of a midrash or kind of a sermon on a particular anniversary, because there were remains of Maccabean monuments there. But I tell you that this is a most accomplished audience. You can tell something about the audience from the book itself. He is expecting his audience to know Plato well, to know the Gorgias particularly, which he is echoing all the way through at one point, the conversation between Socrates and Callicles, and that a good man cannot hurt, a bad man cannot hurt a good man, even if he kills him. All of this is echoed there. He is expecting his audience to recognize allusions to Euripides. He uses, as in the Trojan women, when you're reviling the Greeks, what are you going to write? Here lies a little boy done to death by the Greeks because they were afraid, and you've got something very like that. But he also knows this old Eleazar is a sensible fellow. The king says, please eat. I like you, old man. We respect each other. Don't make me kill you. You know that what you eat is not going to hurt you greatly. And Eleazar says, I know, I would eat if I were in a corner, but I'm not going to eat when the whole world is looking at me, because that's Chilul Hashem. They expect me not to do this. This is a desecration of the divine name. And you've got a discussion about cardinal sins, the sins, I hope some of you at least may get this, for which a man Yehorig Val Yavor, which consists of adultery, idolatry, and murder. And you have got, here it seems to me, a perfect skein of the best of both traditions in a very, very elegant book. Now, this book is terribly important. It's the first kind of elegant sermon like this. This is the model for all sermonizers. It's also the model for all martyrologies. The martyrology of martyrdom of Polycarp, which is the earliest, is obviously an echo of this. And this is an extremely interesting book, and certainly grist for my mill. Well, I must say a word about the Apocalypse, which would bring in the Book of Enoch. And this is a whole category. We've got one apocalypse in the Old Testament, which is the Book of Daniel. There's Revelations at the end of the New Testament, which consists of about 4 different apocalypses tied together, most of them originally Jewish. And there are many others. This is, you see, it's a prophecy after the event, put into the mouth of some mysterious character out of the past who might have had an opportunity to learn the mind of God, to have seen secrets, who writes them and hides them away with the provision that they should be uncovered at one particular time in the future. This is a well-known genre. For example, of Enoch, it is said, probably Genesis 7, I'm not entirely sure, that he walked with God. It doesn't say that he died, he walked with God. When he walked with God, he learned certain things, which he has now written down, and this, at this juncture of time, you open it up. They're usually written in times of stress to encourage people. They are, in a strict sense, forgeries. Of course, Enoch didn't write it, but the man isn't claiming credit. They're all anonymous. And for what I want to say later, I'm going to need this little point anyhow. But it's very interesting. If you're just semi-cynical about it, you can say that people always start writing apocalypses in time of trouble. When everything is going well, you don't bother. But if things are going badly, all the good people are suffering, and there are a lot of bad Romans coming around, and they're no good at all, and they're riding high. Well, how do you explain the flaw in the universe? Well, you put off the explanation and talk about eschatology, the end of days, you see. Then you forget about it when prosperity comes back. But Enoch is at least an example of this, which people ought to know. It's not a delight to read. It's not nearly as much fun as Judith or Susanna or Bel and the Dragon. Then there are a number of other things. I won't say anything about Qumran, because I've got a lot of stuff there. There are things like ancient forms which have been doctored. For example, the Sibylline oracles, which are in Greek. 3 and 7 are Jewish ones, pretty obviously, put into the name of this Roman prophetess, written in wretched hexameters, or Phocylides, 230 lines of pseudo-Phocylides. Well, that's the second category. The third category is the literature of Alexandria, which we have a great many fragments, all transmitted. Well, there was a man called Alexander Polyhistor, who was interested in writing about exotic peoples for Rome. He lived in the early part of the 5th century BC, and he wrote a book on the Jews, which consisted of excerpts out of many Jewish books. Now, these excerpts from Alexander Polyhistor are quoted in the 9th book of Eusebius' Historia Evangelica, 300 and something, or in Clement of Alexandria, which is earlier, and so we have quite a collection of them. But before I talk about those, if I ever get time to do so, I ought to say a word about the Septuagint itself, which is the Fons et Origo of all of the Alexandrian, the Greek Jewish literature. This was made under Ptolemy Philadelphus, which is to say early in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Not the whole thing, the Pentateuch. The rest of it was made later, and it's quite different. And the Pentateuch is so literal that it offends good Greek taste. The rest of it is more literary. Some of the books are so different from the Masoretic Hebrew text that they seem to have had a different basis. For example, Jeremiah is a much different and longer book in the Septuagint than it is in the Masoretic text. One of the most fascinating things about the discoveries at Qumran is that some of the scriptural parts seem to be closer to the Septuagint than to the Masoretic. The text was still fluid, you see. The Pentateuch text, no question, that's fixed. But the later books, the Haggai, the writings, and so on. But what I want to talk about again is this: the effect of translation. As far as fusion of ideas is concerned, it is not merely a question that you're taking these Hebrew words and putting them into Greek, but something is happening. I give you an example, the series of words which have to do with soul. Now, neshama, or ruach, does not mean what you mean by soul. It may mean breath, or wind, or blast, or something like that. You translate it into Greek, and you put in psyche, or you put in pneuma, and you carry, the minute you use those words, you import all of the meanings for psyche, which are connoted by the Greek word as a result of all the thinking of the Greek philosophers. And therefore, they then have this meaning in Hebrew. And this, it seems to me, is one of the richest sources that are mingling. Matter of fact, some of these books that I said were translated into Greek may have been written in Greek. The reason we say they're translated is because the Greek is a translation kind of Greek. That's exactly like somebody praying in Elizabethan English. They established a certain language. I'll give you a better example. When God reveals himself to Moses, the burning bush, I am that I am, or however you translate it. This is translated in the Septuagint, ho-on, own the participle, being, like ends. Nothing like that suggested by the Hebrew. This is a thoroughly philosophic connotation. We're used to to-on, the being material. What the translator has done is put it in the masculine, ho-on. And I think this shows better than anything else. It is the best process of the fusion of ideas, which comes from the mere fact, the mere mechanical process of translation. I've got a lot of things here to say, and I wanted to give one example at least of the reverse influence, and I shall give only one. But let me take my word for it. I can give you more, but perhaps not as dramatic. Now, I'm going to tell you the story of Virgil's Aeneid. This is going to take a couple of minutes, and this many of you have read in high school, but maybe you've forgotten it. Now, let me tell you the story. The story is that a people, at a moment of national humiliation, have been defeated, are put providentially under the charge of a particular leader, providentially chosen. He's the only first-class Trojan left at the end of the Trojan War. And he is told to go back and carry his people back to a promised land, from which indeed Dardanus, the founder of the Trojans, originally came. He takes the Penates, the Sacra in his arms, very different characters than Achilles, let's say. And he takes them by a long roundabout route because they need to be disciplined. They frequently get discouraged and they have repeated epiphanies and finally come to the promised land and they conquer the natives and establish themselves and get started on this mission, which is to civilize the whole world. If I tell it to you that way, can't you think of something? Of course you can. You've all been to Sunday school. And it's perfectly obvious. Here, my argument here is this. I've got steps. I don't like to refer to myself. I seem to have been doing it all evening. But there's a book called Hellenistic Culture, Fusion and Diffusion, which has got a chapter on this. And if you're curious enough, you can look at it. But you see, a Roman poet is bound to follow Homer. Homer is the canon. Everything in the Iliad is like Homer. But when he parts from his model, he is doing it for a special purpose. Now, Aeneas is a very, very different dish. He is carrying out a mission. He is not obsessed with self. He's got a duty to perform. He's got to settle his people in the promised land and perpetuate their laws and so forth. Another thing, I spoke to you about apocalypsis. Now, aren't any in Greek. This comes out of the intertestamentary period. Virgil is using this technique over and over again. I'll take one case which is startling, which you will remember. When Aeneas, the dog, leaves Dido, she kills herself, and she promises that an avenger will rise from her ashes, and this is going to be Hannibal. Now, I've read this book many times. And each time I read it, I'm astonished at the clairvoyance of this woman who could foresee so many centuries. You see, the story, fictive date is the 12th century BC. Hannibal, 218 BC, 200 BC. But Virgil himself, just about 15 or something BC. So easily he can prophesy after the event. But since he's put himself back so far, he makes credit for his story. You say, my goodness, this man was pretty good. Therefore, when he goes on to the real future, you're still inclined to believe him. I mean, this is the technique of the book of Daniel. We know exactly when Daniel was written because he goes off the deep end when he starts prophesying and guesses wrong. The next battle, you see. So I have better arguments about Posidonius and so forth, but I think this one is the more dramatic one. And the importance of Aeneas of the Roman system. This is the scripture of Rome and the history of Europe. For example, when in the later ages, in the Middle Ages, they're discussing the divine right of kings and so forth, what they're talking about is Aeneas. Oh, they do mention House of David and the Maccabees, but what really, you see, because the importance of the Aeneid was extremely great, anybody who was literate knew it. So I thought that since I was going to talk about an oscillating movement, the pendulum going back and forth, I should give you at least one specimen of the pendulum moving the other way. And I'm convinced that this is so. It hasn't got into the books about Virgil yet, but I think it's so, and you don't have to believe me. I meant to leave a particularly long time tonight because this is the last lecture, and I thought there might be an accumulation of questions. But there are, according to my watch, 6 minutes, so I will entertain questions.
Isn't there an influence of the Gnostic doctrine in the Book of Enoch and somewhat in
Almost certainly is. But what do we mean when we say Gnostic? We're not ready yet until we get all of this stuff out of Egypt, which people have been sitting on for a long time. There almost certainly is. The man to tell you about that is Mr. Hans Jonas. Hans Jonas, the new school. He is the Gnostic. There's a gentleman over here.
I missed the name of that story you said that was so interesting. I found it particularly stimulating. The woman who married so many and lost her husband. What was that name?
She comes out of the Book of Tobit. This is an old story of a lady who has some sort of bad thing, who marries husbands, and actually before the marriage is consummated, on the wedding night, the husband dies. This is the Book of Tobit. Read the whole story. It'll be interesting. I'm not telling you to read all of Enoch, but you can read all of Tobit, you can read all of Ecclesiasticus.
It seemed to me that last time you mentioned you would comment on the Book of Job this time.
You know, I did talk about Job at some length, but I've got an out for that. If you're at home Sunday morning at 10 o'clock and turn on Channel 2, CBS, I will be discussing Job. And if you turn it on, this is a lamp to my feet, if you turn it on the week following, I'll be discussing the Dead Sea Scrolls. So these are the tendencies.
You've told us that the ideas oscillated between Hellenism and Hebraism. What movements of that sort were there among people? Were there mass conversions? Were there mass movements in areas away from Judaism or towards Judaism?
I'll tell you, I think that the movement was generally in the direction of integration. Perhaps homogenization is the word. The effort to stop this, for very good reasons, I'm not going to evaluate the reasons, came from the inside, were externally imposed. I spoke a week or two ago about syncretism in religion, how the Greeks were perfectly willing to recognize any local major deity as Zeus, and so the natives were also, and Baal Shmin and so forth. Now, I have repeatedly said that it seems to me that the date, which is the watershed, is about 70 or the years following, that until 70, movement was free because you could still be very loyal to Judaism, to the temple, whatnot, and be humanistic in your interests. You could be as relaxed as the Pharisees were in many respects. They were the ones that were the freest. After 70, when you have two new factors that come in, sovereignty is gone. How do you express loyalty? There isn't any other way. How do you keep together? How do you keep together? You keep together by a book, by a way of life, which comes out of discussing a book. And this is what Yochanan ben Zakkai, at least, is a great figure who did when he brought people around a table and said, Rome can do what it will. We have a different kind of unity and a different kind of loyalty. Point one. The other point is the rising danger of burgeoning Christianity. And you see many of these books, even a book like The Wisdom of Solomon, a book like Philo. I don't know how a little boy's eyes are bigger than his stomach. On my paper I had Philo, Josephus, all these things that I was going to talk about. But even Philo is a step. I don't think a dangerous step, but he is a step in the direction of Christianity. The Septuagint had been used by Christian authors, and some of these more generous interpretations, casual interpretations, which is why the Septuagint was barred. Everything was barred. So that the movement, I think, taken at its own worth, you see what happened in the ancient world. Well, undoubtedly, a great many of them did become Christians, and a great many of them were assimilated. A great many were killed. After 70, the enslavement of the Jewish population was huge. Hundreds of thousands of slaves were taken to Rome. The Colosseum was built by Jewish slave labor and other things of that kind. A great many settled in Egypt. The migration to Egypt was continuous from way before the Maccabees and very heavy all through the Maccabean rule. Emperor Claudius has got a letter, and there are other decrees. Please stop this migration down from Palestine. We can't take any more down here. They were all putting down quotas about how many could get to. The migration was particularly heavy in North Africa, around Carthage. And the reason there, this is something that my revered colleague Baron and I have talked about. You see, just as a good many Jews who were Yiddish-speaking found it agreeable to go to South Africa, not for reasons of apartheid, but because, you know, if you talk Yiddish pretty well, you're practically talking Dutch. Or vice versa. So this was easy. They found the language easier. In northern Africa, with the Carthaginian tradition, you're talking a Semitic language. The Carthaginian magistrate is a shofet. And you have things like Hannibal, you see, and the things which you could understand. They're practically Hebrew. This might explain why 3rd and 4th century, all of the fiery Christians, Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine, all Northern Africans, that Christianity took hold in Northern Africa much quicker than it did on the banks of the Tiber, because these people were already predisposed. They had been prepared. I think this is. There's so many of these factors that are involved. We don't know how these things go. A question that I said before, a book like Aristeas, how much influence would it have? Would anybody read it? Would you go down to a bookstore and buy it? Well, the answer always has been no, but I'm becoming more and more convinced that in this day when people were curious about exotic religions and so forth, that people did read it. Particularly people like Virgil may have read it, who is interested in questions of this kind, and who comes from around, who lived around Naples. You know, in Pompeii, you even have signs on the walls advertising gefilte fish. I think the time is up. Thank you very much indeed. I've enjoyed this.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.